The hook landed before the lights even came on. A nurse, a badge, a room full of people who looked away, and one split second that changed everything. At Silver Ridge Medical Center in Cedar Falls, Colorado, emergency room nurse Emily Carter was finishing her 12th hour when Officer Dale Pruitt walked in with a handcuffed teenager bleeding from a head wound and immediately started barking orders at her like she was furniture. She told him the boy needed a CT scan. He told her to shut up and step back. He grabbed her arm, in front of everyone, and not one person in that ER moved. Then a military transport pulled up outside. 6 soldiers, 1 stretcher, 1 man barely breathing, and a soldier at the door pointed directly at Emily and said, "Her, only her." Officer Pruitt's face went white. He had no idea what he'd just done. If this story already has you hooked, do me a favor. Follow along to the very end. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really started. Cedar Falls wasn't a small town, but it felt like one sometimes, especially at Silver Ridge Medical Center, where everybody knew everybody and the ER ran on a skeleton crew after 9 p.m. The hospital sat on the eastern edge of the city, where the strip malls thinned out and the mountains started to show themselves past the overpass. It was the kind of place that handled car accidents, construction injuries, the occasional overdose. Real emergencies happened, but not the kind that made the news. Most nights were manageable. Most nights the staff knew what they were doing and why. Emily Carter had worked the overnight shift for 3 years. She'd chosen it. Quieter at the start, busier toward dawn, and nobody hovering over her shoulder trying to micromanage things they didn't understand. She was 29, which meant the older nurses sometimes still talked to her like she was a student, and the newer ones came to her when something scared them. She was neither warm nor cold. She was steady, which in an emergency room was worth more than either. She didn't gossip in the break room, didn't complain about the vending machine being broken, didn't bring cupcakes on birthdays. She came in, she worked, she went home. Nobody knew much about her past. She'd mentioned once, briefly, that she'd served. Nobody pushed. That night, a Tuesday in late October, she was 3 patients in when the radio crackled near the intake desk. She wasn't supposed to hear it, but she did, because she'd trained herself a long time ago to hear everything in a room at once. The dispatcher's voice. Officer requesting medical assist, non-compliant suspect, minor head trauma. Standard language. She'd heard it 100 times. She kept her eyes on her patient, a 63-year-old man with suspected cardiac arrhythmia, and asked him to breathe slowly. The double doors blew open 11 minutes later. Officer Dale Pruitt came in first, which told Emily something immediately. Experienced officers let the paramedics lead. Pruitt was maybe 40, heavy-set in the way that came from years of not being told no. He had the kind of face that expected compliance. Behind him, 2 paramedics wheeled in a handcuffed teenager, 16 or 17 at the most, dark hair matted to his forehead with blood, eyes unfocused. The restraints were still on both wrists. Emily straightened. "Bay 3, said Janine, the charge nurse, already moving. Emily moved with her. The boy's pupils were unequal. She could see it from 6 feet away. "He needs imaging," she said, not loudly, not aggressively, just as a fact. "Unequal pupils, possible intracranial bleed. We need a CT before anything else." Pruitt turned to look at her like she'd said something offensive. "He needs to stay restrained and calm down first." "The restraints are cutting circulation to his left hand," she pointed, "and he can't calm down if there's pressure building in his skull." Pruitt took a step toward her. Not a big step, just enough to establish that he thought his presence was a form of argument. "I don't think I asked for your medical opinion." "You didn't have to." She met his eyes without blinking. "It's my job." Janine made a small sound, somewhere between a cough and a word she decided not to finish. The 2 paramedics pretended to check the gurney's wheels. Dr. Marcus Webb, who had seniority in the room and should have backed Emily up, suddenly found something very interesting on his clipboard. Pruitt moved closer, too close, inside what any reasonable person would call her space. "Listen to me very carefully. I've got a violent suspect in your ER, and I will not have a nurse who doesn't know her place telling me how to do my job." "I'm not telling you how to do your job," Emily said. Her voice didn't change. "I'm telling you what's happening inside that kid's head." "Step back." He said it quietly, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted it. "Before I have you removed." Emily looked at the boy on the gurney. His left hand was visibly swelling. His eyes were drifting. She stepped forward instead. Emily. That was Janine. Quiet. Urgent. Remove her, Pruitt said, turning toward Webb. Get her out of this bay. Webb cleared his throat. Officer, she does have a point about the imaging. I said remove her. What happened next was the kind of thing that didn't get reported in incident forms because it happened too fast and too quietly, and everyone was too unsettled to write it down accurately. Pruitt grabbed Emily's arm, not a shove, not a push, a deliberate grip above the elbow, and walked her 2 steps backward toward the wall. She didn't resist. She didn't make a sound. She looked at him with an expression that he clearly read as submission because he let go and turned back toward the gurney, looking satisfied. It wasn't submission. She'd clocked the camera angle, the exit points, the number of people in the room, and every word he'd said since he walked in. She'd also memorized the badge number on his chest without appearing to look at it. It was something she'd learned to do a long time ago, in places where that kind of information kept people alive. She moved to the back of the bay and watched. Webb ordered the CT. To his credit, he did that much. But the delay had cost them. By the time imaging confirmed what Emily already knew, the boy's pressure had climbed. She stood in the hallway and gave Webb the intervention sequence he needed without being asked, speaking quietly, just the 2 of them, and he followed it. He was a decent doctor. He just wasn't built for confrontation. The teenager stabilized 40 minutes later. Pruitt was in the waiting area the whole time, on his phone, looking like a man who fully expected a commendation at the end of his shift. Emily walked past him twice. He didn't look up either time. She went to the break room at 11:15, poured coffee she didn't intend to drink, and stood at the window looking at the parking lot. Her hands were completely steady. She noticed that the way she noticed everything, as information, not as comfort. Janine came in 10 minutes later. You okay? Janine asked. Yes. You should file a report. What he did. I know. Emily. I said I know. She didn't say it harshly. She looked at Janine with the kind of tired patience that came from understanding how institutions worked, how reports got filed and lost and quietly buried. I'll handle it. Janine hesitated. Dr. Whitmore wants to see you tomorrow. Hospital administration. Something about the incident tonight. She paused. I think Pruitt complained first. Emily absorbed that. She nodded once. Go get some sleep, she said. I've got 2 more hours. The call came in at 12:47. Emily was redressing a laceration in Bay 6 when she heard the ambulance radio crackle at a frequency she hadn't heard in years. Military band, compressed transmission, the kind used in field operations where standard channels were compromised. She paused with the gauze in her hand. Nobody else in the ER noticed. Nobody else would have known what it meant. She tied off the dressing, told her patient she'd be right back, and stepped into the hallway just as the automatic doors at the ambulance bay slammed open. 4 people came in fast, 2 in military uniform, 2 in civilian tactical gear, all of them moving with that particular economy of motion that came from doing dangerous things long enough that urgency stopped looking like urgency. On the gurney between them was a man, broad-shouldered, maybe mid-30s, wearing shredded clothing that had been cut away to allow field dressings. The dressings were soaked through, 3 of them. The IV line running into his left arm had been placed fast and at an angle that told her whoever did it was doing it one-handed, probably while moving. She was already calculating. What do we have? Webb stepped out of Bay 2. One of the uniformed men, older, creases in his face like a topographic map, looked at Webb without looking at him. We need Emily Carter. Webb blinked. Excuse me? Emily Carter. That's who we were told to ask for. A beat of silence. Emily stepped forward from the hallway. That's me, she said. The man's eyes found her. Something in his face shifted. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. We were told you'd be here. Dr. Reyes said you were the only one who'd understand what we're dealing with. Who's the patient? Special Forces. Sergeant First Class. He was extracted from a training environment 3 hours ago. GSW to the right side, secondary fragmentation, suspected pneumothorax, and he had a reaction to the field anesthetic. We think it's compounding the trauma response. Allergic reaction or adverse interaction? Adverse. He's got a documented sensitivity. We have his file. The man reached into a vest pocket and pulled out a folded medical card, military format, laminated, the kind that went with operators into the field. Emily took it, read it in about 4 seconds. Who administered the ketamine? Field medic. Didn't have the full records. Okay? She pocketed the card. Bay 1. Move him now. Webb was still standing there. Emily, protocol requires Bay 1, she said again, not looking at him. Get respiratory up here, and I need a chest tray. Don't open it yet. I'll tell you when. There was a half second where the ER just sort of held its breath. Then Janine, who had come back from her break early for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, started moving, and the 2 paramedics who'd seen Emily work before that night started moving too, and after another second, Webb started moving, and the gurney rolled into Bay 1. Pruitt was still in the waiting room. He came to the bay doors when he heard the commotion. His shift had technically ended, but he'd stayed, probably because he liked the way authority felt inside a hospital. He watched the military personnel moving through the ER with the expression of a man who considered this his territory and didn't like surprises in it. What's going on? He said, to no one in particular. One of the tactical operators glanced at him without stopping. Secure area. Step back, please. I'm a police officer. Step back, sir. Pruitt looked at the man. The man didn't look away. Pruitt stepped back. Inside Bay 1, Emily was working. The pneumothorax was real, tension, not simple, which meant the lung was already being pushed and the mediastinum was beginning to shift. She could hear it in his breath sounds even before the stethoscope confirmed it. She called for the needle, gave Webb the intercostal landmark without preamble, and talked him through the decompression while she managed the airway from the other side. Her hands were precise and unhurried in the way that looked unhurried because she'd done it before, in conditions that made this ER bay look like a surgical suite. The man's oxygen saturation climbed, his blood pressure steadied. The fragmentation was the next problem. 2 pieces, subcutaneous, neither close to major vessels, which meant they could wait, but the wound site needed proper irrigation and packing before infection got a foothold. She walked Webb through it. He was asking questions at first, then he stopped asking questions and just listened. And somewhere in that shift, he seemed to understand that the person next to him wasn't guiding him out of courtesy. She was the most qualified person in the room, and they both knew it. The military commander, she'd learned his name was Sergeant Major Denton, stood at the edge of the bay and watched her work in a silence that wasn't tense. It was the kind of silence that came from respect. He didn't interfere. He didn't offer suggestions. Once, when a nurse hesitated over a supply, he quietly retrieved it himself and handed it across. At 1:48 a.m., Sergeant First Class Aaron Merritt's vitals were stable, his oxygen was holding, and the immediate threat had passed. Emily stripped her gloves and stepped back. Webb exhaled like he'd been holding his breath the entire time. He stopped. That was good work. The fragmentation needs imaging before morning. Get radiology down here. She pulled off the second glove. And someone document his ketamine sensitivity in the system so the next person who treats him doesn't make the same mistake his field medic did. I'll see to it, Denton said from behind her. She turned. He was looking at her with something complicated in his face. Captain Carter, he said. The room went very quiet. Emily looked at him steadily. Sergeant Major. I didn't know you were here. He stopped. Gathered himself in the way soldiers did, brief and efficient. I knew the name. I didn't know it was you. It's been a while. 7 years. His jaw worked. You know Merritt? No, but I know what he needed. Denton nodded once, slowly. Then he did something that nobody in that ER had ever seen in the middle of a trauma bay. He stood at attention and gave a precise, formal salute. On behalf of the unit, he said, Thank you. Emily didn't return the salute. She just nodded, the way she nodded at everything, like information received, properly filed. But Janine, standing near the door, saw her blink once, twice, and press her lips together for just a moment before her expression settled back to neutral. Outside, in the hallway, Officer Dale Pruitt had been watching through the bay window. He'd seen the whole thing. He'd seen the salute. He'd seen the title. His face had gone the color of old concrete. He was still standing there when the ER doors opened again, and this time it wasn't one military vehicle in the parking lot, it was 4. And the men getting out of them weren't combat medics. They were investigators. The 4 vehicles parked in a line along the ambulance bay, and the men who climbed out of them moved differently from the soldiers who'd come in with merit. Those men had moved with the trained urgency of people who were used to carrying someone else's life in their hands. These men moved slow and deliberate, the way people moved when they already had what they needed, and were simply deciding how to use it. Emily watched them from the bay window for 3 seconds before she turned back to check Merritt's oxygen line. Denton had seen them too. He stepped to the edge of the bay, spoke quietly into the radio clipped near his collar, and listened to something Emily couldn't hear. Whatever the response was, it tightened the skin around his eyes in a way that wasn't quite worry, more like confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "Who called them?" Emily asked. "Wasn't us." He glanced at her sideways. "Someone filed a complaint tonight, from inside this hospital." She already knew. She didn't say it. In the hallway, she could hear the shift change beginning, the soft noise of incoming staff, the shuffle of clipboards, the particular morning-tired energy of a hospital moving from night into early day. It was almost 3 a.m. Outside, the parking lot was beginning to lighten in that false way it did before the sun actually appeared, the sky going from black to dark gray like a bruise fading. Cedar Falls was quiet at this hour. The mountains past the overpass were invisible in the dark. She finished checking the line, confirmed Merritt's blood pressure was holding where she needed it, and walked out into the hallway. Pruitt was still there. He'd moved from the bay window to the far wall, arms crossed, and he'd done something to his face in the last 10 minutes that was meant to look like composure, but was actually the careful blankness of someone recalculating. He watched her come out of the bay, and she watched him watch her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "That your complaint?" she asked. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The investigators outside." He shifted his weight. "I filed a report about a staff member interfering with police procedure. That's standard." "You filed it while the patient was still in crisis." Something moved across his face. Not guilt, exactly. More like irritation at being read accurately. "I was doing my job." "You were protecting yourself." She said it the way she said most things. Not as an accusation, just as a fact being stated out loud for the first time. Which is fine. People do that. But you should understand that what happened in there tonight is on record too, and the people who just walked into this hospital are going to want to look at all of it. He uncrossed his arms. Took a step toward her. She noticed he was doing the same thing he'd done earlier, using his size as punctuation. She'd stopped finding it interesting the first time. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "I don't know what your deal is with the military, and I don't care. This is still my jurisdiction." "It's a hospital," Emily said. "Jurisdiction is more complicated than you think." She walked past him. Oh. The lead investigator's name was Harlan Voss. He was maybe 52, wearing civilian clothes that fit the way clothes fit on people who'd spent years in uniforms, squared at the shoulders, nothing loose. He had a federal ID that Emily looked at once and handed back, and he shook her hand with the specific neutral firmness of someone who'd learned not to give anything away in a handshake. They spoke in the small consultation room near the nurses' station, the one with the bad fluorescent light that flickered on the left side and drove everyone crazy. Emily had always liked it for exactly that reason. It kept meetings short. "You treated Sergeant First Class Merritt tonight," Voss said. It wasn't a question. "I did." "Sergeant Major Denton tells me you led the intervention." "Dr. Webb was the attending. I assisted." Voss looked at her with the particular patience of someone who had already talked to Webb. "Dr. Webb describes it differently." Emily didn't respond to that. "We're going to need a full account of the evening," Voss said, "starting from when Officer Pruitt arrived with his suspect. Everything you observed, everything that was said to you, any physical contact." He paused. "We've already pulled the bay camera footage." She looked at him. "How long have you been watching him?" A small pause. "That's not something I can discuss." "How long?" she said again, not impatiently, just with the same quiet insistence she used on everything. Voss set his pen down, looked at the flickering light for a moment, then back at her. 14 months, he said. "Tonight gave us something we didn't have before." She absorbed that. 14 months of reports building in some federal filing system, waiting for a moment when Pruitt's pattern became undeniable. Tonight, in front of military personnel and security cameras and half a dozen witnesses, He'd grabbed a nurse in a trauma bay and used a patient's medical crisis as a venue for a personal power display. It was, in the language of investigations, what Voss would probably call a triggering incident. There are other complaints, she said. It wasn't a question either. Several, filed at the department level and closed at the department level. Voss picked his pen back up. We'd like yours on record. You'll have it. She told him everything, in the order it happened, without editorializing. She'd always been better at reporting than storytelling. The facts in sequence, the exact words where she could remember them, the physical actions with precise description. She told him about the grip on her arm, the placement, the duration. She told him what Pruitt had said to Webb. She told him about the teenager's delayed CT and the unequal pupils, and the specific window of time they'd lost while Pruitt performed his authority in the middle of someone's medical emergency. Voss wrote without looking up. He was the kind of note-taker who got everything. When she finished, he asked 2 follow-up questions and then closed his notebook. Captain Carter, he said, and she registered the title without reacting to it. Word traveled fast in small buildings. You understand this is going to become public. I know. The complaint Pruitt filed against you doesn't concern me. He considered her for a moment. It should, at least procedurally. There'll be a process. There always is. She stood. Is there anything else? Voss stood too, with the unhurried motion of someone who had more to say, but had decided not to say all of it tonight. We may need you again, he said, once the department review begins. I'll be here. She moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. The boy, the teenager Pruitt brought in. His name should be on the incident report. Make sure someone follows up on his status. He's not part of your investigation, but he's part of what happened tonight. Voss looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened, exactly, but recalibrated. I'll make sure of it, he said. Dawn hit the break room window at 5:40, and Emily was still there, on her second cup of bad coffee, when Janine came in and sat down across from her without being invited, which was the most assertive thing Janine had ever done in Emily's presence. People are talking, Janine said. I know. Not badly. They're just... She wrapped both hands around her own mug. Nobody knew. Nobody had any idea. Emily looked at the mountains, which were visible now, pale and enormous, past the overpass. There wasn't a reason for anyone to know. Captain, Janine said, and then stopped, like the word embarrassed her slightly. Sorry, I don't know what to call you now. Emily, she said. Same as before. Janine was quiet for a moment, then, what did you do? In the military, if you can say. Emily drank her coffee. She thought about how much of this answer was hers to give, and how much of it belonged to the years themselves, to the places and the people and the things that happened in the spaces between the things that got written down. She thought about the answer she'd given dozens of times to dozens of people who asked, and the one she'd never given to anyone. Combat medicine, she said. Forward operating environments. Mostly mountains. A few years? She paused. It wasn't anything I could keep doing indefinitely. Janine nodded like she understood, though Emily suspected she didn't, not really, which was fine. Not understanding was honest. Why nursing? Janine asked. After all that. Because I already knew how. Emily set her mug down. And I wanted to do it somewhere that wasn't a war. Janine didn't say anything for a long moment. The fluorescent light in the break room hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a cart wheeled past. The hospital was waking up around them, the morning shift taking over in increments, the night slowly surrendering its hold on the building. For what it's worth, Janine said finally, I should have said something. When he grabbed you, I should have... You didn't know what was going to happen next. I could have said something anyway. Emily looked at her. Yes, she said. You could have. She stood, picked up her mug, and rinsed it in the sink. Next time. She wasn't trying to be cruel, she was trying to be accurate. There was always a next time for something in a place like this, and the only thing that changed outcomes was whether people acted differently when it arrived. She went home at 6:15, slept 4 hours, and came back. This was not what anyone had expected. Webb met her at the entrance with a look that was half guilt and half something that might have been admiration if he'd been slightly more comfortable with his own feelings. You don't have to be here today, he said, given everything. I'm scheduled, she said. Administration wants to I'll deal with administration when I'm off the floor. She walked past him. The morning was strange. That was the only word for it. The ER staff moved around her with a new kind of awareness. Not deference, exactly. Not yet. But the careful attention you gave to something you'd underestimated and were now trying to recalibrate. People made eye contact differently. The orderly who'd never once spoken to her directly said, "Good morning." One of the younger nurses, a 24-year-old named Petra, who'd watched Pruitt grab Emily and said nothing and had clearly been feeling terrible about it ever since, stopped her near the supply closet and said, "I'm sorry," in a very small voice. Emily said, "Okay," and meant it, because she did not have the bandwidth to carry other people's guilt on top of her own weight. And because Petra was young and had done what most young people do in moments they didn't expect, she'd frozen. That was human. That was forgivable. What was harder to forgive, though she was trying not to think of it that way, was the hospital itself, the structure of it, the system that allowed Pruitt to walk into a trauma bay and dictate terms and have it be treated as normal, have it be absorbed and accommodated and worked around, because that was what hospitals trained their staff to do with difficult men who had authority. They trained them to accommodate, to smooth over, to manage. Emily had never learned that. She wasn't sure if it was a flaw or not. She was in Bay 4 at 11:30, working with a patient who'd come in with a dislocated shoulder from a construction site fall, when Denton appeared in the hallway. He waited. She noticed him waiting and finished what she was doing, walked the patient through the post-reduction care instructions, made sure he understood the follow-up appointments, and then stepped into the hall. "Merritt's awake," Denton said. She followed him down the corridor. Sergeant First Class Aaron Merritt was not what she'd expected, which was her own failure of assumption. She'd treated him unconscious and had built some internal image of him from his vitals and his file and the shape of him under the dressings. The actual man was quieter than that image and younger looking. He had brown eyes that were alert in a way that told her his brain was intact, and a jaw that was clenched in the specific way of someone managing pain they'd rather not acknowledge managing. "You the one who worked on me?" he said. "I helped," she said. "That's not what Denton says." Denton was outside the bay for part of it. Merritt looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face, not gratitude exactly, which would have been too easy, too performed. More like the specific weight of a person who understood what it meant to owe someone something they couldn't fully articulate. "Thank you," he said. Not loudly, not formally. Just a man saying a thing he meant. "Get some rest," she said. "Radiology still needs to clear you on the fragmentation." She turned to leave and he said, "Hey." She turned back. "They told me about what happened. The cop." She waited. "That going to be a problem for you?" "I don't know yet." He nodded slowly, like that was the answer he'd expected, and the one he most respected. "I know some people," he said. "If it becomes one." "I'll handle it," she said. Denton caught her in the hallway on the way back. He fell into step beside her the way soldiers fell into step, naturally, without making a thing of it. They walked half the corridor in silence. "Administration called me this morning," he said. She already knew what was coming. "They're asking for a review of last night. Pruitt's complaint triggered a formal process, which you probably knew it would." "I did." "And Voss's people are moving faster than I expected. They've already subpoenaed the department's incident records for the last 18 months. Pruitt's not the only one they're looking at." He paused. "His supervisor. 3 other officers who co-signed some of his reports. 1 city council liaison who apparently buried 2 separate internal complaints." Emily stopped walking. She turned to look at Denton directly. "How bad is it?" He considered the question honestly, which was something she'd always respected about career soldiers when they were being real with you. They either gave you the truth or they told you they couldn't. They rarely did the civilian thing of giving you something padded. "Bad enough," he said, "that I think you should have a lawyer before the hospital review happens. Not because you did anything wrong, because people who are cornered do stupid things, and Pruitt has friends in this building, and I want you protected." She absorbed that. "You think someone here is going to try to burn me?" "I think someone here might try to make the complaint look mutual. Frame it as a conflict between staff and law enforcement instead of what it actually was." He met her eyes. "I think they might try to use your military background against you. Say you were aggressive, escalated things." She thought about the footage. The way she'd moved, the way she'd spoken, the 2 steps backward she'd taken when he'd gripped her arm. She was actually grateful, in a cold and practical way, for her own training, because it meant she'd done nothing that day that couldn't withstand a careful viewing. "Let them watch the footage," she said. "I intend to make sure they do." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. "This is a JAG attorney I trust. She's not military anymore, but she knows how these things work, and she's not afraid of local politics." Emily took the card, looked at it, didn't pocket it yet. "You planned this," she said, not accusingly. "No, but I was prepared for it." He looked at her steadily. "You have people in your corner, more than you know. Don't make the mistake of thinking you have to do this alone, because that's what you're used to." She thought about Janine saying I should have said something. She thought about the 14 months Voss had been watching. She thought about Petra's small sorry in the supply room hallway. She pocketed the card. The hospital review was scheduled for the following morning, 9 a.m., in the administrative conference room on the 4th floor. Emily knew this because Webb told her, and she knew it was earlier than normal because someone had pushed to expedite it, and she knew who that someone was without having to ask. She arrived at 8:45 and found 3 things waiting for her that she hadn't expected. The first was Voss, standing in the hallway outside the conference room with his notebook and his neutral handshake expression, which meant the federal investigation had expanded into the hospital's administrative process faster than anyone had anticipated. The second was the JAG attorney, whose name was Rita Aldrin, who had sharp gray eyes and a blazer that said she'd dressed for a fight, and who had apparently already reviewed the security footage because she shook Emily's hand and said, "You were impressively restrained," in the tone of someone who was pleased by this for strategic reasons. The third was Dale Pruitt, standing at the far end of the hallway with his police union representative and the particular expression of a man who had spent the night being told he had nothing to worry about and was beginning to have doubts. He looked at Emily across the length of the hallway. She looked back at him with the same expression she'd used every other time. Not anger, not triumph, not even satisfaction. Just the steady, observant attention of a person who understood exactly what was happening and was ready for all of it. Then the conference room door opened, and the hospital CEO, a thin woman named Dr. Linnea Park, who wore reading glasses on a chain and looked like she hadn't slept, stepped into the hallway and said, "We're ready." Everyone moved. The room was already full. Emily counted 8 people at the table before she sat down. Department heads, the head of hospital security, an HR representative she'd never spoken to, a woman with a recorder. Dr. Park sat at the head of the table. She looked once around the room, then at Emily, then at Pruitt, and then at Voss, who had taken a chair slightly away from the table, which in the language of these rooms meant he was there to observe, not participate. But everyone in the room understood that his presence meant the federal government was watching every word. "This review," Dr. Park said carefully, "is being convened to address a formal complaint filed by Officer Dale Pruitt of the Cedar Falls Police Department regarding the conduct of nursing staff during an incident in the emergency room on the night of October 21st. She glanced at her notes. Specifically, the complaint alleges interference with police procedure and failure to cooperate with law enforcement directives. Emily said nothing. Pruitt's union rep said, "We appreciate the hospital's prompt—" "I'm not finished," Dr. Park said without raising her voice. She turned a page. "Concurrent to this complaint, the hospital has received a formal inquiry from federal investigators regarding Officer Pruitt's conduct during the same incident, including unauthorized physical contact with a staff member, interference with a medical procedure, and actions that contributed to a documented delay in patient care." She looked up. "We'll address both." The union rep's mouth closed. Emily felt Rita Aldrin shift beside her, the small movement of someone settling in for exactly the kind of fight they came prepared for. And then Dr. Park said something that nobody in that room had expected. "Before we proceed," she said, setting her reading glasses down on the table with a precise click, "I've reviewed the Bay camera footage from last night, all of it." She looked at Pruitt directly for the first time. "Officer Pruitt, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, because the footage is already in federal hands, and whatever you say here will be compared to it." A pause. "Is there anything you'd like to correct in your written complaint before we begin?" The room went completely silent. Pruitt looked at his union rep. His union rep looked at the table. And Voss, from his chair slightly removed from the proceedings, opened his notebook to a fresh page and clicked his pen. Pruitt looked at his union rep for 4 full seconds, which was long enough that everyone in the room understood he was deciding whether to lie and whether it would work, and the answer to the second question was becoming apparent to him in real time. "I may have," he started, then stopped. Tried again. "There may be some details in the complaint that could be clarified." Rita Aldrin didn't move, didn't write anything, didn't react in any way that would give him something to push against. Voss wrote something in his notebook. Dr. Park put her reading glasses back on. "Then let's go through it," she said, methodically. What followed was 2 hours and 17 minutes of the most precise institutional dismantling Emily had ever witnessed from the inside, and she'd seen a few. Dr. Park ran it without apparent emotion, which Emily suspected cost her more than it looked, because Park was not an unfeeling person. She was a person who had learned to keep feeling out of rooms where it would be used against her. She asked questions in the order the footage supported them, which meant she already knew every answer before she asked, which meant Pruitt's options narrowed progressively until he was doing something that looked a lot like a man trying to describe a color he was insisting he hadn't seen. The union tried to reframe twice. Rita Aldrin countered both times with language so clean and specific that it shut the reframes down before they could gain any footing. Emily sat beside her and said almost nothing for the first 90 minutes, which was what Rita had advised, and which suited Emily's temperament exactly. When Dr. Park asked Emily to describe the physical contact, Emily described it without adjectives. Duration, placement, direction of force, the exact words spoken before and after. She watched Voss's pen move. When she finished, Park said, "Is that consistent with what the footage shows?" Voss said, from his chair at the edge of the room. "Yes." That was the only time he spoke. It was enough. By the time the review formally recessed at 11:40, Pruitt's complaint against Emily had been administratively suspended pending the federal investigation, which in the language of institutions meant it was effectively dead. His union rep said they would be consulting with counsel, which was the thing people said when the ground had shifted enough that they needed to find new footing before they said anything else. Pruitt left without looking at Emily. She watched him go from her seat, not because she needed to, but because she'd learned a long time ago that you watched people when they were losing. Not out of satisfaction, out of necessity. The way a person exited a room they'd been in control of told you a great deal about what they'd do next. He left fast and quiet, which was actually the more dangerous version. The federal inquiry formally expanded at 1 p.m. that same day, and Emily learned about it the way she learned most things at work, from Janine, who had heard it from a night security officer who'd spoken to one of Voss's team members while they were setting up access to the hospital's external camera system. The expansion covered 3 areas beyond the immediate incident: Pruitt's previous conduct reports over a 30-month period, the internal complaint process at his department that had closed at least 4 formal grievances without review, and the conduct of his direct supervisor, a lieutenant named Gareth Moss, who had co-signed 3 of those closures and had, according to what Denton told Emily quietly in the hallway outside Merritt's room that afternoon, also made 2 phone calls to hospital administration in the early hours of the morning before the review, calls that Dr. Park had, to her considerable credit, not returned. "Moss called the hospital," Emily said. "Twice," Denton said. "We know because Voss's team pulled the communication records as part of the expanded inquiry, and Park disclosed it voluntarily. She was apparently not thrilled about it." "What did he want?" "We don't know exactly. Park said he suggested the review might benefit from being, quote, handled internally without federal involvement." Denton paused. She told him she'd already made her decision and ended the call. Emily looked through the window at Merritt, who was sitting up now, arguing good-naturedly with the radiologist about the imaging schedule. His color was better. His blood pressure, when she'd last checked, was stable and trending in the right direction. The fragmentation had cleared imaging cleanly enough that the surgical team decided to leave the smaller piece and monitor. Not ideal, but the risk calculus favored waiting over another procedure this soon. He was going to be fine. She'd known it by 2 a.m. the night before, the moment his oxygen held. But there was a difference between knowing and confirmed felt like something she could put down. "What happens to Moss?" she asked. "That's Voss's question to answer, but the calls to the hospital are a problem. They could constitute interference with an ongoing investigation. Depends on exactly what he said and whether Park is willing to testify to it. She will, Emily said. She'd watched Park in that conference room for 2 hours. She knew what kind of person Park was, the way you knew things about people after you'd seen them under pressure. Denton seemed to agree, because he didn't argue it. Instead, he said, "There's something else. One of the complainants, a woman who filed against Pruitt 14 months ago and whose complaint was closed by Moss. She's been contacted by Voss's team. She's willing to speak." Emily turned from the window. "How many complaints were closed?" "4 that we know about. Voss thinks there may be more that were never formally filed because people understood they would go nowhere." He met her eyes. "You know how that works." She did. She'd seen it in other contexts, other institutions. The weight of pointlessness that accumulated around reporting systems that demonstrated repeatedly that reporting changed nothing. It wasn't apathy that stopped people from filing. It was experience. "What does she need?" Emily asked. "Who?" "The complainant. The woman. What does she need?" Denton looked at her for a moment. "Voss's team is handling her case." "I know. I'm asking what she needs." She said it carefully, the way she said things when the carefulness was intentional. Because filing is one thing and going through the process is another, and if this goes to a formal proceeding, she'll be in rooms with people who are going to try to make 14 months of her experience look like a misunderstanding. Denton was quiet for a moment. "I'll find out her name." "Don't give it to me without her permission." He nodded once. "Understood." Merritt was discharged under military medical supervision 4 days later. The morning before he left, he asked a nurse, not Emily, because he'd correctly read that asking Emily directly for something personal was unlikely to land well, to let her know he was being transferred. She came to his room on her break, stood in the doorway, and he said, "I want to tell you something before I go." She came in, stood near the window. "When I was in the field," he said, "the medic we had, good person, trained well, she made a call that she second-guessed afterward. It wasn't wrong, the call. The outcome was bad, but the call was right given what she knew. And she spent a long time not being able to separate those two things." He looked at the mountains out the window. "I guess I'm saying you made the right calls, both in this room and in the other room, with the cop." He glanced at her. "Don't second-guess them because the fallout is complicated." Emily looked at him for a moment. She thought about the teenager, Marcus Del Rey. She'd learned his name now, 17 years old, whose CT had come back showing a subdural bleed that had been caught and treated and who was currently recovering at Cedar Falls General with his mother. She thought about the 11 minutes of delay. She'd run that calculation more than once in the hours between sleep and not sleep. 11 minutes, with unequal pupils and rising pressure. The margin had been narrower than she liked. "The boy is okay," she said, not to reassure Merritt, but because she needed to say it out loud to herself. "I heard." He nodded. "And you're the reason." "I'm one of the reasons." She straightened. "Take care of yourself, Sergeant. Don't rush the recovery because someone tells you you're needed back sooner than you're ready." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. "That's specific." "You seem like the type." He laughed, short and real, and winced at the movement. "Fair." She was at the door when he said quietly, "Thank you, Captain." She paused, didn't turn around. "Just Emily," she said, and walked out. The story broke on a Thursday. Not the version she would have chosen, not the version anyone controlled, the version that leaked out of the federal investigation through the specific kind of osmosis that happened when too many people knew something and the thing was too strange to stay contained. A journalist at the Cedar Falls Register had a contact in the police department who had a contact near the Moss situation, and by Thursday afternoon the online version had the basic facts assembled, if not entirely accurate. Nurse challenges officer, officer removed from case, federal investigation, military involvement, nurse has classified background. That last part wasn't accurate. Her background wasn't classified in any sweeping sense. But it was unusual, and unusual was what the headline needed, and Emily understood this the way she understood most things she couldn't change, without bitterness, because bitterness was expensive, and she spent her energy elsewhere. Dr. Park called her at 4 p.m. "I want you to know before you see it everywhere," Park said. "And I want you to know that the hospital's official position is that our staff member acted appropriately and with full compliance with our medical protocols." "Thank you." Emily said. I should have said that more clearly in the review, Park said, which surprised Emily. Not because it was false, but because hospital administrators rarely acknowledged procedural regrets without lawyers present. I was managing the federal component carefully, and I think I was overly neutral. You were doing your job, Emily said. So were you. A pause. How are you holding up? Emily looked out her apartment window at the street below. A neighbor's dog was pulling at its leash. A truck was trying to parallel park and failing. The mountains were there in the far distance, pale and permanent. I'm fine, she said. I'll need that to be true, Park said, because the next few weeks are going to require you to be visible in ways I suspect you find uncomfortable. She was right about that. Emily thanked her and ended the call and sat with the specific discomfort of being seen, which was different from being known and considerably harder. The second complication arrived on Friday morning and came from a direction she hadn't expected. Internal Affairs at the Cedar Falls Police Department, a separate body from Voss's federal team, slower and with considerably more invested in its own department's reputation, opened a parallel inquiry and assigned it to a captain named Theodore Harwick, who was Moss's contemporary, had worked with him for 9 years, and whose appointment to lead the review was, as Rita Aldrin told Emily over the phone that afternoon, the kind of decision that is either spectacularly stupid or deliberately obstructive, and I genuinely don't know which yet. Harwick requested an interview with Emily. Rita said no, not without complete clarity on the scope, and Harwick pushed back, and they went back and forth through formal channels for 2 days while Voss's team watched with what Emily imagined was a mixture of professional interest and mild contempt. But then Harwick did something that shifted the situation in a way nobody had entirely anticipated. He pulled Marcus Del Rey's emergency intake record, the teenagers, and filed a supplementary inquiry arguing that the medical delay on the night of the incident, the 11 minutes, constituted grounds for a joint review that should include nursing staff conduct alongside Pruitt's. Emily found out through Rita at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. He's trying to make it mutual, Emily said. That's exactly what he's doing. He's not going to succeed because the footage shows the delay was caused by Pruitt's interference, and not by anything you did, but he's going to create enough procedural noise that the federal inquiry has to navigate around it. Can he? Slow it down? Yes, briefly. Change the outcome? No. But Emily... Rita paused in the way she paused when she was about to say something she'd been deciding whether to say. There's a version of this where Harwick isn't protecting Pruitt. There's a version where he's protecting Moss, who is significantly more senior and whose exposure is significantly larger. Pruitt is a problem. Moss is a liability. And Harwick might be trying to create enough collateral confusion that when the federal findings come down, Moss has procedural grounds to argue the investigation was compromised. Emily processed that. He's using me as a distraction. He's trying to. She sat with that for a moment. The specific quality of rage that came from being used as a tool in someone else's self-preservation. She'd felt it before. It was familiar in the way that things you never got used to were still familiar from repetition. What do I do? She asked. Nothing, Rita said. You show up to your shifts, you document everything, and you let me and Voss's team handle Harwick. You are the least useful thing you can be to him if you are completely, boringly, procedurally clean. I can do that. I know. That's why I'm not worried. She was on the floor. Monday morning, Bay 2, when Denton came in at 9:40 with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something between urgency and the carefully managed version of it that field-experienced soldiers wore when they were trying not to spread alarm. We need to talk, he said. She finished recording the BP she'd just taken, handed the chart to the floor nurse, and followed him to the consultation room. He closed the door. Voss's team executed search warrants this morning, he said. Pruitt's home, his locker at the department, and a storage unit registered to Moss. He paused. They found documentation, physical files, copies of complaints that were never entered into the system, handwritten notes about specific complainants, and... He stopped. And, she said, a notebook. Moss's handwriting, names and addresses, people who'd filed or threatened to file complaints against officers under his command. He met her eyes. Your name is in it. The room was very quiet. Emily heard the fluorescent light, She heard a cart somewhere in the hallway. She heard her own breathing, which was steady, which was information. "From when?" she asked. "The date next to your name is 3 days after you started working here." He said it carefully, which meant the implication was what it sounded like. "We don't know yet if it was proactive research or if someone flagged you to him. But if someone in this hospital identified you to Moss before any incident occurred, then what happened Tuesday night wasn't random," she said. "We don't know that. But Voss wants to know who at Silver Ridge had access to your employment records, your prior service history, if it appears anywhere in your HR file, and any communication between the hospital and the department prior to Tuesday." She thought about that. About the night of the incident, about Pruitt walking in with Marcus Delray and the way he'd moved through the ER. Not like a man who was escalating because of something that happened in the room, like a man who already knew the terrain. "Someone told him who I was," she said. Denton didn't confirm or deny it directly. He was too careful for that. "Voss's team is going to need your employment records and anything you can tell them about communications you've had with hospital administration since you were hired." "I haven't had many." Any could matter. She stood up, sat back down, stood up again, which was unlike her, and she noticed it was unlike her, and she made herself stand still and think. 3 years. She'd worked here 3 years. She'd chosen this hospital because it was a good facility, reasonable acuity, night shifts available, and far enough from where she'd served that the overlap of worlds was unlikely. She'd been careful without being paranoid. She'd disclosed her military service on her application the way you had to, without elaborating, and she'd assumed, wrongly, possibly, that information stayed where she'd put it. "Who in HR would have access?" Denton asked. "Director level and above. Depending on the system, department heads can pull employment summaries." She paused. "And anyone with administrative access who knew how to look. Voss will need names." "I'll make a list." She said it flatly, not angrily, which was how she handled things when anger was present but not useful. "I'll have it to Rita by tonight." Denton nodded. He looked at her in the way he sometimes did. Not like a superior, not like someone who pitied her, but like a person taking inventory of another person and finding the inventory what he'd expected. "You know, this means the scope of this is larger than one officer's bad night," he said. "It was always larger than that." "I know. I'm saying it out loud because sometimes things need to be said out loud." He reached for the door. "You're not alone in this, Carter. I want you to actually believe that, not just acknowledge it." She looked at him. "I'm working on it," she said. He left. She stayed in the consultation room for 2 minutes, alone, and allowed herself exactly that long to feel the full weight of what she now understood. This wasn't a complaint, a bad night, a rogue officer with poor impulse control. This was a system that had seen her coming and had made plans accordingly, and those plans had failed because of a single wounded soldier at 1:47 in the morning and a military response nobody had counted on. That was the fragile, specific thread everything had hung on. Then she stood, smoothed her scrubs, and went back to the floor. The warrant findings hit the press by Wednesday, which was faster than anyone had predicted. The reporter at the Register had clearly been cultivating sources inside the federal inquiry, and by noon the notebook, a handwritten list of complainants maintained by a senior police official, was the lead item on every local news site and 3 regional ones. The reaction inside Silver Ridge was difficult to describe and impossible to ignore. The cafeteria was louder at lunch than Emily had ever heard it, clusters of staff in the hallways that dispersed when a supervisor walked through. 2 nurses who'd worked at the hospital for more than a decade asked Emily separately if what they were reading was true, and she told them both the same thing: talk to HR and let the investigation do its work, which was accurate advice and also completely unsatisfying, which she knew, which was why she gave it rather than something more satisfying and less reliable. Webb found her in the medication room at 2:15, the quiet kind of found her that meant he'd been looking for a moment where she was alone. "I want to say something," he said. She waited. "I should have backed you up that night, when he told me to remove you." He didn't look away, which took more effort than it might have appeared, because Webb was a man who was more comfortable with equipment than with the parts of himself he didn't like. "I didn't, and I want you to know I understand that." "Okay," she said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not looking for anything. I just wanted to say it to your face." She looked at him for a moment. He was telling the truth and he wasn't making it about himself, which was harder than it sounded. and she gave him credit for both. It matters that you're saying it, she told him. It matters that you know. He nodded, started to leave. Webb. He turned back. You were good in that, Bay. When it counted. He held that for a second. Then he nodded again and left, and she went back to work. Thursday afternoon, Voss called Rita with preliminary findings from the Warren execution, and Rita called Emily at 6 p.m. with the version she was cleared to share. The notebook contained 41 names. 38 of them were people who had filed or attempted to file complaints against officers under Moss's command over a 6-year period. 2 were names Voss couldn't yet account for. 1 was Emily's. The storage unit had physical copies of 17 complaint files, all formally closed, 7 of which showed evidence of alteration. Dates changed, witness statements missing, 1 with what appeared to be a forged signature. Pruitt's personal effects included a phone with deleted messages that the federal team's technical unit had partially recovered. Among them, a message sent the week before the incident containing Emily's name, her shift schedule, and the words, "Flag her if she interferes." Emily sat in her kitchen with the phone pressed against her ear and said nothing for a moment after Rita finished. "Who sent it?" she asked. "Number traces to a prepaid. We don't have attribution yet." "But it came from someone who knew my schedule." "Yes." She looked at her kitchen table, the coffee mug she'd used that morning, the stack of medical journals she'd been meaning to read for 3 weeks, the specific normalcy of a life she'd built carefully and incrementally in a place she'd thought was separate from the things she'd come from. "They were going to set me up," she said. "Not a question. The working theory is that someone identified you as a risk, not necessarily because of the military background, possibly just because of your reputation for not backing down. And Pruitt was primed to create an incident that would result in a formal complaint against you before you could file one against him. A preemptive strike." Rita's voice was precise and careful. "It didn't work the way they planned because of merit, and because of the footage, and because you did exactly what you did." Emily turned that over. A preemptive strike, in an emergency room, on a Tuesday night. "How high does it go?" she asked. "That," Rita said, "is the question Voss is answering right now. And Emily, I need you to be prepared for the possibility that the answer is higher than anyone has said out loud yet." She sat with that. Outside her window, the mountains were dark shapes against a sky going purple at the edges. Cedar Falls was doing its evening thing, traffic thinning, streetlights flickering on, the particular quieting of a city that was done with the day. Her phone buzzed with a second call. Unknown number. "I'll call you back," she told Rita. She switched calls, said nothing, waited. A man's voice, not Voss, not Denton, not anyone she recognized, calm and unhurried in the way of someone reading from a prepared position. "Ms. Carter," he said, "my name is Leonard Harwick, Theodore Harwick's brother." She said nothing. "I think we need to meet," he said. "There's information relevant to your situation that you don't have yet, and I need to give it to you before the federal team gets to a particular person who is going to say things that will complicate matters for everyone, including you." "Why would I meet with you?" "Because what I know about how your name ended up in that notebook," he said, "is going to change what you think you understand about the last 3 years." The line was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street below, its headlights sweeping briefly across her ceiling. "Where?" she said. She called Rita back first. "Someone just contacted me," she said. "Leonard Harwick, Theodore Harwick's brother. He wants to meet. Says he has information about how my name ended up in the notebook." The silence on Rita's end lasted exactly 3 seconds, which was longer than Rita usually took. "Don't meet him alone. Don't meet him without telling Voss first. And don't assume anything he tells you is given without a purpose." "I know." "Emily, Leonard Harwick is a real estate attorney. He's represented at least 2 properties connected to Moss in the last 4 years. He is not a neutral party who stumbled onto information out of goodwill." "I understand that." "So why are you considering it?" Emily looked at the ceiling. "Because he said something specific about the last 3 years. Not the last 3 weeks. 3 years. She paused. "That's when I started at Silver Ridge." Another beat of silence. "I'll call Voss," Rita said. "Don't respond to Harwick until I get back to you. Don't call him, don't text him, don't acknowledge the call in writing anywhere." "Understood." She put the phone down and sat in the dark of her kitchen for a while, long enough that the automatic hallway light clicked off, and she didn't move to turn it back on. 3 years. She'd run the calculation already. When Denton told her about the notebook, she'd started from the date beside her name and worked backward. 3 days after she was hired. Which meant someone had identified her not because of anything she'd done in the ER, not because of any confrontation or complaint, but because of who she was before she walked through Silver Ridge's doors. The question she hadn't answered yet was who at the hospital had known enough to flag her, and to whom. She thought about her HR file. She thought about the employment application, the service history she'd disclosed, the single line that said combat medicine, separated honorably, and the box she'd checked that said no classified restrictions on employment disclosure. She thought about who would have looked at that file, and when, and what they would have done with it. She thought about something Denton had said that she'd filed away without fully examining. Someone in this hospital identified you to Moss before any incident occurred. Not a random tip, not a bureaucratic accident, someone who saw her file and made a decision. Voss called her at 8:45 that evening. He'd already spoken to Rita. His voice had the particular quality it got when he was managing several pieces of information simultaneously and had decided how much of it to share. Leonard Harwick is not who he's presenting himself to be, Voss said. He contacted you because he's trying to get ahead of something. We've been aware of his connection to Moss for some time. What connection exactly? Property. Money. The kind of relationship that looks like business until you look at the timing. He paused. He may have information that's genuinely useful to you. He also has information that's useful to him, and he's hoping to exchange one for the other in a way that shapes how we use what we already have. He wants to negotiate through me. That's the working theory. He knows you're central to the case, and he knows you're not law enforcement, which means a conversation with you doesn't have the same legal weight as a conversation with us. He wants to give you something that makes him look cooperative without it constituting formal cooperation. Emily turned that over. Can I still meet him? Voss was quiet for a moment. With conditions. You'd be wearing a wire, which requires your consent. Anything he tells you becomes part of the investigation. And you'd need to understand that the conversation might not go the way he's planned it, and his reaction to that could be unpredictable. What do you need from me going in? Let him talk. Don't lead him toward specific topics. Don't confirm or deny what we have. If he says something that surprises you, don't let him see it surprise you. A pause. Can you do that? She almost said of course, but stopped herself because that kind of certainty was overconfident, and she'd learned to be honest about the difference between what she was trained to do and what she was emotionally prepared for on a given day. I can do it, she said, but I want to know what he's most likely to tell me before I go in. I can give you our best guess. Then give it to me. Voss gave her 20 minutes. The broad shape of it was this. Moss had been running a quiet operation for at least 6 years. Not organized crime, nothing that dramatic, but a systematic protection racket at the institutional level. Officers under his command operated with the understanding that complaints would disappear. In exchange, certain things moved smoothly. Contracts, inspections, zoning decisions that benefited people Moss knew. It was the kind of corruption that didn't look like corruption until you had the whole picture, because each piece of it looked like ordinary professional courtesy or bureaucratic discretion or a favor between people who'd known each other a long time. Leonard Harwick had been the attorney who handled several of the property transactions that sat at the edges of this arrangement. I wasn't a criminal in the prosecutable sense, or at least he'd been careful enough that the line was genuinely blurry. But he knew enough to be useful, and he knew he was about to be named in federal documents, and he was trying to find a way to shape what came next. Emily's name in the notebook was, according to Voss's current theory, connected to a piece of this that nobody had fully mapped yet. A property near Cedar Falls that had been scheduled for a zoning review 3 years ago. A complaint filed against a city official involved in that review. A complaint that had been handled by Moss's department and quietly buried. And somewhere in that chain, Emily, or more specifically, her military background and her reputation for not staying quiet, had registered as a variable that someone wanted managed before it became a problem. She didn't know what she had to do with a zoning dispute. She said so. You may not have anything to do with it directly, Voss said. It's possible your name was flagged simply because someone ran a background check on new hospital hires, and yours came back unusual enough that Moss filed it away as a precaution. He kept names like other people keep tools, in case they became useful. In case I needed to be neutralized. In case the situation required it, yes. She sat with that for a long moment. Being on a list. Being pre-categorized as a risk before she'd done a single thing to justify it. Before she'd challenged anyone or filed anything or made a single noise that could be heard outside her own shift. Just the fact of what she'd been, where she'd served, the kind of training she carried in her body. That alone had been enough to make someone put her name in a notebook and leave it there like a loaded option. She thought about whether that should surprise her. She decided it didn't. "I'll wear the wire," she said. "Whoa." The coffee shop was called Meridian, 2 miles from the hospital, exposed brick, and too many pendant lights, and enough ambient noise that individual conversations dissolved into general hum. Leonard Harwick was already there when Emily arrived at 6 on Friday, which told her he was either punctual or nervous, and the way he stood when he saw her, too quickly, knocking the edge of the table, told her it was both. He was 50-something, heavier than his brother, with the kind of face that had been handsome 20 years ago and now carried its history in the jaw and around the eyes. He shook her hand and it was slightly damp. She noted that without reacting to it. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You said you had information." "I do." He sat down. She sat across from him. He'd bought her a coffee she hadn't asked for, which sat between them now like an obligation. She didn't touch it. "I want to be clear about something first. I'm not here as anyone's representative. I'm here as someone who made some decisions that I'm now reconsidering. Reconsidering because of the federal investigation." He looked at her for a moment. "Partly. What's the other part?" He wrapped both hands around his own mug. He was choosing his words with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd practiced this, but was finding the practice version less useful than he'd hoped now that he was actually in the room. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 24. She works at a clinic in Denver." He stopped. "That's not relevant. I'm just—" He exhaled. "There are things I knew about and didn't do anything about. And then I found out what they did to you specifically, and I—" He stopped again. Emily waited. She was good at waiting. "Your name was given to Moss by someone inside Silver Ridge," he said, 18 months after you were hired. Not 3 days. 18 months. She absorbed that without letting it show. The date in the notebook was wrong, or had been put there wrong deliberately, or she'd miscounted. She made a note to check. Who gave it to him? A hospital administrator, not Park. Someone below her, in the operational layer. His name is Grant Fielder. He was the deputy director of operations at Silver Ridge for 6 years. Emily didn't recognize the name immediately, which meant Fielder operated in the part of the hospital that didn't intersect with the floor. Administrative infrastructure, budget, contracts, vendor relationships. The layer that ran the building without ever touching a patient. Why? She asked. Silver Ridge had a contract renewal coming up. Medical supply chain, significant dollar amount. The vendor involved had a relationship with Moss, not direct, routed through 2 other companies, but traceable. Fielder wanted the contract to go through without friction. Moss wanted to know if there was anyone inside the hospital who might raise questions about procurement irregularities. Leonard turned his mug in a slow circle on the table. You'd apparently asked some questions about supply costs, unofficially, through a colleague. It got back to Fielder. Emily thought back 18 months. Supply costs. She had asked about that, not formally, not as any kind of complaint, just a conversation with one of the pharmacy technicians about a pricing discrepancy she'd noticed on a medication order. She hadn't pursued it. She'd filed it as not her department and moved on. Someone had noticed she'd noticed. Fielder put my name to Moss over a conversation I had with a pharmacy tech, she said. That's what I understand, yes. And Moss kept it. Moss kept everything. That was how he operated. Leonard looked at the table. I handled a property sale for him 2 years ago. Commercial building, nothing unusual on the surface. I didn't ask the questions I should have asked about where the money was sourced. And then last year another transaction came across my desk with the same pattern, and I asked, and I was told not to. He paused. I didn't do anything then either. And then all of this happened, and I looked at what I knew and what I'd ignored, and I couldn't. He stopped. My daughter works in a clinic. She's a nurse practitioner. She goes to work every day and trusts that the systems around her are functional, that people in authority positions aren't. He broke off. The conversation had gone somewhere he hadn't planned for it to go. Emily could see that. He'd come in with a structured offer, and it had cracked open into something messier and more real, which was inconvenient for everyone, but also, she thought, probably accurate. "You should talk to the federal investigators," she said. "I know. Not as a negotiation, as a witness." "I know." He looked at her. "I'm going to. I wanted to tell you first because what they did to you was specific and deliberate, and you deserve to know why before it became public." He paused. "And because I thought you might find it useful to know Fielder is still at Silver Ridge. He hasn't been contacted yet. Voss's team doesn't have his name." She kept her expression level. Under the table, she was aware of the small device taped below her collarbone, transmitting everything to a receiver. 2 tables away, where one of Voss's agents sat reading a paperback with methodical inattentiveness. She was aware that Voss now had a name he hadn't had 40 minutes ago. "You said Moss's date in the notebook was wrong," she said. 3 days versus 18 months. Why would he change the date?" Leonard frowned slightly. "I didn't say the date was wrong. I said your name was given to him 18 months after you were hired. The notebook date might reflect when he first received the information or when he decided it was actionable. Moss was organized, methodical. He backdated some things, not to deceive, but to note when he'd first begun monitoring someone. He may have had earlier intelligence on you that I'm not aware of. Earlier than 18 months after I was hired. It's possible. I only know about Fielder's contact because Fielder told me. Nervously. Recently." His mouth compressed. "He's scared. He's been scared since the warrant news broke, and he's been calling anyone he thinks might know what's in those files." Emily thought about Fielder in a building she worked in every day, scared and making calls, and not yet knowing that the federal investigation was about to find him. She thought about what it meant that he'd had her name put in a notebook 18 months into her employment over a question she'd asked a pharmacy technician about a price discrepancy on a medication order. The specific pettiness of it. The specific and disproportionate machinery that had been deployed against her for such an ordinary, observant human thing as noticing that numbers didn't add up. "Thank you," she said to Leonard Harwick. She stood. "Call Voss's team tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." He looked up at her. "Will it matter? For how this goes for me?" She looked at him for a moment. He was a man who had made choices for bad reasons and was now making a different choice for mixed ones. And she didn't think that entitled him to comfort, but she also didn't think it entitled her to contempt. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That's not my decision. But not calling will definitely make it worse." She left the coffee shop without touching the coffee he'd bought her. But Voss had Fielder's name processed into the warrant expansion by 9 p.m. that Friday. Emily knew this because Denton texted her at 9:14. A single line, "They have him." And she sat on her couch and read it twice and then put her phone face down on the cushion beside her and looked at the ceiling for a while. Grant Fielder was placed on administrative leave from Silver Ridge the following Monday morning, which was the hospital's way of distancing itself from him before the formal proceedings began, which was institutional self-preservation in the specific flavor that Emily had come to recognize over the past 3 weeks. Park called her personally to inform her, which was more than she was required to do. "I want you to know," Park said, "that I had no knowledge of Fielder's contact with outside parties. His role was operational, and his decisions in that area were largely autonomous. That's a structural failure I'm addressing." "I believe you," Emily said. She did believe her. Park was not a dishonest person. She was a person who had run a hospital and trusted the layer below her and been used by that trust in a way that would cost her professionally and personally for some time. "There's going to be a full internal audit," Park said, "of procurement, vendor relationships, and administrative communications for the past 4 years. I've engaged an outside firm." A pause. "I don't imagine that makes what happened to you easier." "No," Emily said, "but it's the right thing to do." After the call, she sat for a moment thinking about the word structural. Structural failure. It was the honest version of what most institutions called it when the people they trusted turned out to have been operating a shadow version of the organization inside the real one. It wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. Because structures didn't maintain themselves. People maintained them, or failed to. And the failure was always human before it was structural. She went back to her shift. Pruitt was formally arrested on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the incident, in front of the Cedar Falls Police Department headquarters, which nobody had planned but which happened because his attorney had arranged for him to turn himself in at 9 a.m. And a journalist who'd been covering the story since it broke was already there for another reason entirely and had a camera. The footage was not flattering. It was also not dramatic. He walked in voluntarily, in civilian clothes, with his lawyer beside him, and the charges read to him in the lobby were abuse of official capacity, falsification of official documents, obstruction of a medical procedure, and civil rights violation under federal statute. His face in the footage was the face of a man who had spent weeks telling himself the outcome would be different and had only recently stopped believing it. Emily saw the footage because Petra showed it to her on a phone in the break room, and she watched it once and said nothing and went back to her patient. Moss was arrested 2 days later. His was different. Federal agents at his home at 6:30 in the morning, which was the version reserved for people the government had decided not to extend courtesies to. The charges against him were considerably longer: racketeering, obstruction of justice, official misconduct, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and 4 counts related to the altered complaint files discovered in the storage unit. His lawyer issued a statement saying he intended to fight all charges. That was what lawyers said. Lieutenant Harwick, Theodore, the IA captain who'd tried to use Emily as procedural cover, resigned before his own review could conclude, which meant he'd had someone advise him that resignation was preferable to what the review was going to find. His resignation was accepted, and the review continued regardless, which was how federal involvement changed the calculus of these things. Leonard Harwick cooperated. It cost him 2 existing client relationships, and, according to Rita, probably his professional reputation in Cedar Falls for the foreseeable future. But he gave Voss's team a complete account of the property transactions, the money flow, and everything he'd been told or deliberately not told over 4 years of proximity to Moss's operations. Emily didn't know how that would ultimately affect his legal standing. It wasn't her calculation to make. Fielder was charged separately, conspiracy and misuse of confidential employment records, and entered the federal system quietly, without the press coverage that Pruitt and Moss had received, which was the version of consequence that happened to the people who enabled things rather than did them directly. Emily thought about him occasionally, not with satisfaction, but with the particular tiredness that came from understanding how many Fielders there were in how many institutions, people who made small corrupt decisions for small personal benefits and never imagined the math of it adding up to something that would destroy someone else's ordinary Tuesday night. The things that came next came slowly, which was the honest version of how institutional consequences moved. They didn't land all at once in a satisfying sequence. They accumulated, one formal action after another, over weeks that still contained ordinary shifts and difficult patients and bad vending machine coffee, and the particular tedium of paperwork that didn't stop for any of it. The 41 names in Moss's notebook were contacted individually by Voss's team. Of those, 32 agreed to participate in the federal review of closed complaints. 7 declined, some from exhaustion, some from fear, some from a resigned calculation that the system hadn't worked for them before, and they saw no evidence it would now. Emily understood all 3 reasons and didn't judge any of them. The woman who'd filed 14 months ago, her name, which Emily learned only after she'd given permission for it to be shared, was Vanessa Okafor, agreed to testify. She'd been a city employee, a building inspector, who'd reported a pattern of pressure from Moss's officers to approve inspections she couldn't ethically approve. Her complaint had been closed within 10 days of filing, and she'd been transferred to a different district shortly after. She was 43, matter-of-fact in the way that people who'd carried something a long time without resolution became matter-of-fact. And when Emily met her briefly at Voss's field office, not planned, just overlapping schedules, Vanessa looked at her and said, "You're the nurse." "Yes," Emily said. "You're why any of this is happening." She said it without sentiment, just as an assessment. "I want you to know I've thought about how to feel about that, and I decided I'm grateful, even if it took this long." Emily didn't know what to say to that exactly, so she said, "I'm glad you're part of this," and meant it, and they shook hands and went their separate ways into their separate parts of the same proceeding. The formal hospital review of Emily's conduct, the one Pruitt's complaint had triggered, the one Harwick had tried to contaminate with his supplementary filing, concluded on a Thursday afternoon in the fourth-floor conference room with the same 8 people who'd been there at the beginning and one additional federal representative seated at the far end. Dr. Park read the conclusion aloud. Emily's conduct on the night of October 21st was found to be fully consistent with Silver Ridge Medical Center's patient care protocols, professional standards, and ethical obligations. The formal complaint filed by Officer Pruitt was dismissed in its entirety. The supplementary filing by IA Captain Harwick was rejected as procedurally improper and outside the scope of the hospital's review mandate. Park looked at Emily when she finished reading. "I want to say for the record that this hospital failed to protect a staff member who was doing her job correctly. That failure will be part of the audit." She paused. "And it will be part of how we change what we do next." Emily nodded. She noticed she felt less than she'd expected to feel in this moment. Not numb, not dissatisfied, just the specific flatness of a conclusion arriving after so much had already been processed. The formal words were a formality. What had actually happened had already happened, in the places it had happened, and the paper version of it was necessary but not where it lived. She thanked the room and left. Rita called her that evening with the final piece of information that had been pending for days. The prepaid phone used to send Pruitt the message with Emily's name and schedule had been traced through cell tower data to a neighborhood 3 blocks from Moss's home. Not conclusive, not independently, but combined with call records and testimony from a junior officer who'd been in Moss's office the day the message was sent, and who had decided, faced with his own federal exposure, to describe accurately what he'd witnessed. It was enough. The obstruction charges against Moss were amended to include the message. His lawyer's statement changed from fighting all charges to reviewing options for cooperation. That was what lawyers said when the math had changed. Emily listened to Rita lay it out and said, "Is it done?" "The arrest phase, mostly. The proceedings themselves will take time." "I know. I mean the active part. The part where I have to be careful about what I say and where I go and who's calling me from unknown numbers." Rita was quiet for a moment. "Largely, yes. There may be depositions. There will likely be a civil component eventually, which I can help you with. But the active phase..." She paused. "Yes, that part is mostly done." Emily sat with that. She was in her kitchen again, same table, same coffee mug, same mountains barely visible in the evening dark through the window. It looked exactly like it had 3 weeks ago. It was completely different from 3 weeks ago. And the difference was invisible in the physical space of the room, which was the thing about the kind of change that happened through patience and documentation and the grinding forward motion of institutional consequence. It didn't look like anything from the outside. You just found yourself on the other side of it. "Thank you," she said to Rita. "You did the hard part," Rita said. "I did the paperwork." After she hung up, Emily sat for a long time in the quiet. She thought about Vanessa Okafor saying, "You're why any of this is happening." She thought about Merritt laughing and wincing in his hospital bed. She thought about the teenager, Marcus Delray, who was at home now, who had a follow-up appointment she would not be present for, who would probably never know the specific margin by which Tuesday night had gone differently than it might have. She thought about Dale Pruitt in the footage, walking into the building in civilian clothes with his lawyer, and the way his face had looked. She hadn't felt what she expected to feel watching that either. She'd expected something conclusive, relief, or satisfaction, or at minimum the clean sensation of a thing completed. What she'd actually felt was something closer to tired. Not the tired of defeat, the tired of a person who had been carrying a weight for a long time and had finally put it down, and whose body needed time to remember what it felt like to stand without it. She got up, rinsed her mug, and looked at the mountains. She had a shift in 6 hours. She went to bed. What she didn't know, lying in the dark that Thursday night, was that the following morning Dr. Park would receive a certified letter from the State Medical Board's Oversight Division, requesting a formal meeting regarding the systemic issues identified at Silver Ridge during the federal investigation, specifically the administrative structure that had allowed a deputy director to access and transmit confidential employee records without authorization. The letter named 2 specific violations of state healthcare privacy statute and asked Park to appear in 30 days with documentation of corrective action. What she also didn't know was that Fielder, in the process of assembling his cooperation with federal investigators, had disclosed something that Voss's team had spent 2 days verifying before they were prepared to act on it. A secondary set of financial records, separate from the property transactions Leonard Harwick had described, showing payments routed through a medical supply vendor to a private account that traced back, through 2 shell companies, to a name nobody had mentioned yet in any filing, any testimony, or any of the 41 complaint records. A name that appeared nowhere in the investigation's public documents. A name that appeared in exactly one place in the Silver Ridge system. Emily Carter's original employment file, in the field marked referred by, signed by a hospital board member who had processed her initial application 3 years ago and had never, in any conversation about any of this, been mentioned by anyone. Voss found out on Friday morning. He called Emily at 7:43, just as she was walking into Silver Ridge for her shift, and said, "Before you go in today, I need you to tell me everything you remember about how you came to apply for a position at this hospital." She stopped walking. The automatic doors slid open ahead of her, and she stood outside them in the cold morning air, the mountains pale behind her in the early light. "Why?" she said. "Because I need to know," Voss said carefully, "whether someone placed you here." The automatic doors slid open, and the warm air from inside the hospital moved against her face, and she stood in the gap between inside and outside with her phone pressed to her ear and said, "Say that again." "Someone placed you here," Voss said, "or that's what the evidence suggests. I need to know if you knew." The cold settled around her shoulders. A nurse coming off the night shift moved past her through the doors, pulling a jacket on, giving Emily the brief look people gave to people standing in doorways who didn't seem to know which direction they were going. "I applied online," Emily said, 3 years ago. "I found the posting on a healthcare job board. Standard listing, nothing unusual." She paused. "The application was processed normally, as far as I knew. I had 2 phone interviews and 1 in person. I was offered the position by HR." "Who interviewed you in person?" "HR director at the time. A woman named Sandra Collier. She left the hospital about a year later, private sector. And," Emily stopped. "And?" "And 1 board member, which I remember because it was unusual. Board members don't typically sit in on nursing interviews. He said he liked to stay close to clinical hiring, that it was a personal philosophy." She turned the memory over. It had been unremarkable at the time. Odd, slightly, but not alarming. "His name was Robert Callum." Voss's silence lasted 4 seconds. "Robert Callum is the name on the referral field in your employment file," he said, "and Robert Callum's name appears in Fielder's secondary financial records, connected to the same supply vendor account." Another pause. "He resigned from the board 6 months after you were hired. The stated reason was personal commitments." Emily stared at the mountains. They were the same mountains they always were, pale, enormous, indifferent. She had a sudden, specific memory of looking at them through her apartment window on the night she decided to take the Silver Ridge position, thinking that she'd chosen well, that the distance from everything she'd left behind was enough, that she'd built something clean and separate. "He put me here," she said. "We're still verifying the full picture." "But that's the working theory." "Yes." She thought about what it meant for a long moment, standing there in the gap of the automatic doors. Not that she'd been manipulated into a job she didn't deserve. Her qualifications were real, her record was real, no one had manufactured those. But that someone had seen her coming, had looked at her background, had understood what she was capable of, and had decided to position her inside an institution where she might eventually become useful, or disruptive, or both, depending on which way the situation broke. The question she couldn't answer yet was which one Callum had intended. "Is he in Cedar Falls?" she asked. "We know where he is," Voss said. "Don't contact him." "I wasn't going to." "I know. I'm saying it because people in your situation sometimes feel the need to confront directly, and I need you to let us do this one properly." "Understood." She finally stepped inside and let the doors close behind her. The hospital smell, antiseptic, recycled air, the faint chemical sweetness of the cleaning products they used on the floors, settled around her like something familiar. "What do you need from me?" Written account of the in-person interview. Everything you remember about what Callum said to you, how he framed his involvement, whether he asked anything that seemed unusual in retrospect. A pause. "And then go do your shift. Whatever happens next happens in our space, not yours." She said she would. She meant it. She pocketed her phone and stood for a moment in the lobby of Silver Ridge Medical Center, looking at the hallway that led to the ER, at the nurses' station where Janine was handing off to the day shift, at the ordinary morning motion of a hospital beginning its day. And she felt something that she couldn't have articulated cleanly, but that had something to do with the specific weight of understanding that the place she'd thought she'd chosen freely had been, at least in part, chosen for her. That should have made her angrier than it did. She examined the anger and found it was there, but underneath it was something older and more durable. The knowledge that what she'd built inside this place was still real. The patients she'd helped, the procedures she'd run, the things she'd caught that someone else might have missed. Those hadn't been manufactured. Nobody had staged those. Whatever Callum's reasons were, she'd been a real nurse in a real hospital for 3 years. That part was hers. She walked toward the ER. Robert Callum was arrested on a Monday, 3 weeks after Voss's call, at his home in a residential neighborhood in Fort Collins, 45 minutes north of Cedar Falls. He was 61, a former hospital administrator turned board member, turned consultant, and the charges against him were the most complex of anyone swept into the investigation. Conspiracy, financial fraud, violation of privacy statutes, and one count of obstruction related to a communication he'd had with Fielder 8 days after the October incident, in which, according to the recovered message, he'd suggested that the Carter situation needed to be managed carefully and that Fielder should make sure certain records were consolidated. He had engaged counsel within an hour of his arrest, which suggested he'd been expecting it. His attorney's initial statement was brief. His client denied all wrongdoing and looked forward to his day in court. Emily read it on her phone in the break room and felt the same flat tiredness she'd felt at every formal step of this process. The recognition that language like denied all wrongdoing existed specifically to occupy the space between reality and legal proceeding, to function as placeholder text until the actual facts rendered it irrelevant. What Voss told her in a meeting at his field office the following week was this. Callum had positioned himself on the Silver Ridge board approximately 7 years ago, during a period when Moss was consolidating his influence over the department's complaint process. Their connection predated both of their public roles, that they'd worked in adjacent institutional spaces in the late 90s, and the relationship had stayed warm and transactional through the decades. The public proceedings began in January. There were 4 separate cases moving through different channels simultaneously. Pruitt's criminal case, Moss's federal case, the civil proceedings initiated by 11 of the 41 complainants, and a state-level misconduct review of the Cedar Falls Police Department that had been triggered by the federal findings and was proceeding under the supervision of the State Attorney General's office. Callum's case was separate from all of these, but loosely parallel, moving through federal court on its own timeline. Emily testified in 2 of them. The first was a deposition in the civil case, which took place in a conference room in a law firm downtown and lasted 4 hours and was substantially less dramatic than anything that had preceded it. She answered questions in the same way she answered everything, directly, in sequence, without interpretation unless asked. The attorney on the opposing side tried twice to suggest that her actions on the night of the incident had been escalatory, and both times Rita Aldrin objected cleanly, and both times the objection was sustained, and both times Emily waited without expression and then answered the actual question when it was reformulated. The second was a formal witness statement in Moss's federal proceeding, which she gave in a federal building downtown with a court reporter present, and Voss's lead attorney conducting the examination, and Moss's defense team sitting across a long table doing the thing defense teams did, which was watch very carefully for anything they could use. She told what happened. She told it the same way she'd told it every time, because it was the same story. It had always been the same story. And repetition hadn't softened it or complicated it. A teenager came in needing immediate imaging. An officer interfered with that process. She did her job anyway, as well as she could within the constraints she was given, and the teenager survived, and a soldier who needed specific care received it, and the things that were already true about the people who had been doing the wrong things for a long time became visible because the specific night they'd chosen to demonstrate their power in front of cameras and military witnesses had been, from their perspective, catastrophically wrong. Moss's attorney cross-examined her for 40 minutes and found nothing useful. She could see it in the way he returned to his chair at the end, the careful blankness of someone who'd been prepared for more purchase than he'd gotten. Outside the building afterward, in the cold January air, Rita said, "You know you can exhale now." "I'm fine." "I know you're fine. I'm saying you're allowed to also be relieved." Emily looked at the street. A pigeon was negotiating a pretzel someone had dropped on the sidewalk. A bus went past. "I'll be relieved when it's over," she said. "Some of it will never be fully over," Rita said, not unkindly. "That's the part people don't tell you. The formal proceedings end. The feelings don't run on the same schedule." Emily looked at her. Rita was being honest, which Emily valued more than comfort. "I know," she said. "I've dealt with things that didn't run on neat schedules before." "I know you have." Rita pulled her coat tighter. "Lunch?" They went to lunch. It was ordinary and imperfect, and the restaurant was too loud, and Emily's soup was slightly too salty, and it was one of the better hours she'd had in months. Pruitt's criminal trial lasted 9 days. Emily was not required to testify in person. Her deposition statements were entered into evidence, but she followed the proceedings the way she followed most things at a slight remove through reported information rather than direct observation, because she'd learned early that watching the process from inside it consumed more than it returned. The verdict came on a Thursday. Guilty on 3 of 4 counts: abuse of official capacity, falsification of official documents, and the federal civil rights violation. The 4th count, obstruction of a medical procedure, hung on a narrow question of legal definition that the jury couldn't resolve unanimously, and the judge accepted the partial verdict rather than ordering a full retrial. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. 18 months, suspended after 12, with 5 years probation and a permanent bar from law enforcement employment. His badge had already been surrendered. His pension was under separate review. His union, which had spent the first 3 weeks after the arrest issuing careful statements about due process, issued no statement about the verdict. Moss's federal case moved more slowly, as federal cases did, but the weight of the evidence against him was significant enough that by March, his attorney had entered into plea discussions, which was the thing that happened when the math became undeniable. He pled guilty to 3 counts in April: official misconduct, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and racketeering, and the plea agreement included full cooperation with the remaining civil proceedings and the state attorney general's review. The sentencing would come later, but the cooperation agreement meant the full scope of what he'd built and maintained for 6 years would be documented publicly in the proceeding record, which was, Voss told Emily, in some ways more consequential than the prison term. "He'll spend years answering for it in detail," Voss said, "in depositions, in civil proceedings, in reviews, every corner of it mapped and documented. Some people find that worse than the sentence." Emily didn't know if she found it satisfying or just appropriate. She thought maybe those were the same thing, or close enough that the distinction didn't matter. Callum's case went to trial in May and lasted 11 days. His attorney mounted a sophisticated defense centered on the argument that his role was advisory, his actions were within normal board member conduct, and the financial connections were coincidental rather than conspiratorial. It was a well-constructed argument. It required the jury to disbelieve Fielder's cooperation testimony, the recovered communications, and the financial forensics that 3 separate analysts had built into a clear and documented chain. The jury deliberated for 2 days and convicted him on all 3 counts. He stood for sentencing in June, in a federal courtroom, in a suit that was slightly too large. He'd lost weight during the proceedings, visibly. And his attorney made a statement about his years of service and his family and his age, and the court considered all of it and sentenced him to 4 years, 2 to be served with supervised release. The financial penalties were separate and larger. The restitution to the 11 civil complainants was larger still. Emily was not in the courtroom for the verdict or the sentencing. She was at Silver Ridge on the floor, working a day shift. She found out from Rita's text, a single line: "Callum, guilty all counts, sentencing June 14. She read it between patients. She typed back, "Thank you." She put her phone in her pocket and went to check on a 60-year-old man in Bay 4 who was recovering from a cardiac event and was trying to negotiate with his nurse about whether he could have coffee. "No coffee," Emily said from his doorway. He looked at her with the expression of a man who felt this was an injustice. "It's decaf." "Still no." "You're very difficult," he said, but not meanly. "I know," she said. "Drink the water." She moved on to the next bay. The things that changed at Silver Ridge changed slowly and imperfectly, which was the only way institutions actually changed when the change was real. Park's external audit ran through January and February and produced a 90-page report that documented the procurement irregularities, the administrative access failures, and a set of structural recommendations that the board, reconstituted after 3 members resigned in the wake of Callum's indictment, voted to implement in March. The new deputy director of operations was a woman named Carla Reyes, who had spent 12 years at a hospital in Denver and had a reputation for making administrative processes transparent in ways that felt inconvenient until they prevented the kind of catastrophe that had just cost Silver Ridge considerably in legal fees, public trust, and staff morale. Emily met her briefly in the hallway in her first week and formed no particular impression except that she asked direct questions and seemed to expect direct answers, which was a reasonable baseline. HR implemented a new protocol for employment record access, logged, authorized, audited quarterly, that would have prevented Fielder from doing what he'd done. It wouldn't prevent everything. Nothing prevented everything. But it closed the specific door through which the specific harm had entered, and Emily acknowledged that for what it was, a structural improvement made by people who were genuinely trying, within the limits of what institutions could do when they were being honest about their limits. The State Attorney General's review of the Cedar Falls Police Department resulted in a formal consent decree in April requiring independent oversight of the internal complaint process, mandatory third-party review of all complaint closures above a certain threshold, and a restructured IA process that removed the conflict of interest that had allowed Harwick to be assigned to review conduct he was connected to. It wasn't a revolution. It was a set of constraints that made the worst behaviors harder to sustain invisibly. Some of the 41 complainants got what they'd asked for. Some got partial resolutions. Some found that the thing they'd wanted most, to be believed, to have it acknowledged that what happened to them was real and wrong, had already occurred through the public proceedings, independent of any specific formal outcome. Vanessa Okafor returned to her original district. It took time and a formal request and the support of the state review process, but she went back, and the last thing Emily heard was that she was doing her job the same way she'd always done it. Emily thought about that occasionally. The courage of continuing, of going back into the structure that had failed you and doing the work anyway, because the work itself was real, and the failure was the system's failure, not the work's. She understood that in a way that was personal. In May, 4 months after the last formal testimony, Sergeant First Class Aaron Merritt came back to Cedar Falls. He came alone, which surprised her. No unit representation, no formal occasion, just a man who'd driven 4 hours from the base where he'd been finishing his recovery because he'd decided he wanted to. He found her at the end of her shift, which he'd coordinated through Denton, and waited in the hospital lobby reading a newspaper that he clearly wasn't retaining until she came out. He looked better. The color had been back for months in the reports she'd gotten through Denton, but seeing it in person was different. He walked straight, which people who'd had the kind of injury he'd had sometimes didn't, for a long time. He'd left the sling behind weeks ago. He looked like a man who'd been through something and was on the other side of it, carrying it the way you carried things that didn't leave you, but that you'd found a way to hold. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I wanted to." He folded the newspaper. "Is there somewhere we can talk?" They walked to the coffee shop 2 blocks east, the one that wasn't Meridian, the one Emily actually used when she needed air between shifts. They ordered and sat, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was fine with Emily and seemed fine with him too. "I heard about Callum," he said, "and Moss. All of it. Most of it's public record now." "I know." He looked at his coffee. "I've thought a lot about that night. Not the medical part. That's its own thing. I mean the part where you were standing in a hallway by yourself, dealing with all of that, and you just kept working." He looked up. "I've been in situations where everything was going wrong in multiple directions, and the discipline you need to hold it together it's a specific thing. Not everyone has it." "You have it," she said. "I've been trained for it. In specific contexts." He held her eyes. "You had it in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning after an officer assaulted you." She looked at her own coffee. "I was angry," she said. "People think staying calm means not being angry. It doesn't." "I know." "I was angry for most of it. Still am, some days. At what they built. At how long it ran. At the names in that notebook and the people who didn't file because they already knew it was pointless." She paused. The anger isn't the problem. What you do with it is the question. He nodded slowly. What did you do with it? She thought about that. She thought about the medication room and Janine in the break room and Webb at the supply room door. She thought about Voss's notebook and Rita's blazer and the specific flicker of the fluorescent light in the consultation room. She thought about 32 people who agreed to participate and 7 who didn't, and about how she held none of those 7 in anything but respect. I put it somewhere useful, she said. Most of the time. Most of the time, he repeated, like that was the honest part. Yeah. She picked up her coffee. I'm not going to tell you I handled all of it perfectly. I had days where I didn't want to go back in, where the building felt like something that had been contaminated, and I didn't know if I could separate what happened in it from what the building was supposed to be. She paused. I went back because the patients didn't do any of that to me. They just needed someone who knew what they were doing. Merritt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Denton wants to know if you'd be willing to consult, formally, on something he's building. He said it carefully, like he was aware he was stepping into something she might not want. A program, trauma response integration, combining field medicine principles with civilian ER environments, improving how forward medical training translates into hospital contexts and vice versa. A pause. He said it's not military service, it's advisory, your terms. Emily looked at him. He didn't send you here just to say thank you, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. He sent me because I wanted to come, and also because he thought you'd be more likely to hear it from me than from him. He's probably right. She looked at the window, at the street outside, at the ordinary Thursday motion of Cedar Falls going about itself. A woman with a stroller, a delivery truck double parked, a kid on a bike ignoring the crosswalk signal. Tell him I'll think about it. He'll want a timeline. He'll get one when I have one. She looked back at Merritt. How are you? Actually. He absorbed the shift in subject without resistance. Getting there, he said. Sleep's still bad some nights. The shoulder's at about 90%, which the doctors call a full recovery, and I call slightly annoying. Something moved in his face, something real and unguarded. I think about my medic. One in the field who didn't have my full records. She did her best with what she had. She did, Emily said. So did you. So did you, he said back. And then he picked up his coffee and they talked about other things. His plans after active duty, whether Cedar Falls was as cold in February as everyone warned him it would be, the newspaper he'd been pretending to read in the lobby. And it was the most ordinary conversation Emily had had in months, which made it feel like something close to normal, which she was beginning to understand was not a state you returned to so much as a direction you moved toward, imperfectly, one ordinary conversation at a time. Denton's program became real over the following summer. Emily called him in June with a list of conditions. She would consult on the curriculum design and the protocol framework. She would not take a formal title. She would not relocate. She would continue her shifts at Silver Ridge, which had become, again, the kind of place she could walk into without feeling the particular weight of what had happened in its walls. Not because the weight was gone, but because she'd found a way to separate the institution from the corruption that had occupied its edges, and that separation had required exactly the kind of deliberate, repeated choice that nobody told you institutional healing demanded. Denton said yes to all of it, which she hadn't entirely expected. The first workshop ran in August, a 2-day session at a regional training facility an hour from Cedar Falls. 12 emergency medicine professionals, 8 with military backgrounds and 4 without, working through scenarios that tested the intersection of battlefield triage principles and civilian ER protocols. Emily ran 2 of the sessions herself. She was not a natural teacher in the performance sense. She didn't do enthusiasm or inspiration on cue, and she didn't pace dramatically or make anything more dramatic than it needed to be. What she did was tell the truth about what worked and what didn't and why, in the specific and practical language of someone who had done the thing rather than studied the thing, and the room paid attention. The way rooms paid attention when they understood they were getting the real version. At the end of the second day, one of the younger participants, an ER nurse from a hospital in Colorado Springs, 26 or 27, with the look of someone who'd been in the field long enough to know how much she didn't know yet, stopped Emily at the door and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How do you stay? I mean, when everything around you is wrong, When the systems are failing and the people who are supposed to help are the problem, how do you stay clear about what you're doing? Emily looked at her for a moment. She thought about the honest answer, which was that clarity wasn't a constant state. That there had been mornings in the last 8 months where she'd stood in the hospital parking lot for 2 minutes before she could make herself walk in. That she'd cried once in her car in February after a deposition that should have been routine and had instead surfaced something she'd thought she'd processed and turned out she hadn't. That the things people called strength were usually just the visible parts of much longer, messier, mostly invisible efforts to keep going. She thought about what that young nurse needed to hear. Not reassurance, which would be a disservice, but something real. You don't always stay clear, Emily said. Sometimes you get through it confused and angry and second-guessing yourself. The difference isn't clarity. It's whether you keep making the decision that's in front of you, one at a time, even when the bigger picture is too complicated to hold all at once. She paused. Do the thing in front of you. Do it correctly. Document what you see. And don't let someone else's certainty about who you are replace your own knowledge. The young nurse nodded slowly, like she was putting the words somewhere she could reach them later. That's it? She asked. That's most of it, Emily said. The rest you learn by doing. The civil settlement for the 11 complainants was finalized in September, 2 months before the first anniversary of the October incident. The amounts varied by case and were not made fully public, but the aggregate was significant enough that it was reported in the Cedar Falls Register with the specific headline that let readers understand the scale without stating the numbers. More important to most of the complainants, as Emily understood from what she'd heard through Voss's team, was the formal acknowledgement, the documented, legal, court-recorded admission that the complaint process had been manipulated, that their filings had been deliberately buried, that what happened to them was real and wrong and traceable to specific people who were now facing specific consequences. Vanessa Okafor called Emily in October. They had not spoken directly since the brief meeting at Voss's field office. The call lasted 12 minutes and was not particularly emotional, which Emily thought was right for both of them. They were not people who needed sentiment to carry weight. I heard the settlement landed, Vanessa said. I heard the same. I wanted to tell you, not because I think you need to hear it, necessarily, but because it felt right to say directly, that getting to the end of this was something I'd stopped believing was possible. I'd made a kind of peace with the idea that nothing would happen. A pause. I was wrong about that. You weren't wrong, Emily said. You were accurate based on available evidence. The evidence changed. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. You changed it. A soldier had bad timing and ended up in my ER, Emily said. That changed it. Emily. Vanessa said her name with the particular firmness of someone correcting a record. You changed it. The soldier gave you a moment. What you did with the moment was yours. Emily sat with that. She didn't deflect further. Thank you, she said, for being part of this, for the testimony, for all of it. Same, Vanessa said, and then, take care of yourself. Not as a platitude, actually. I will, Emily said. You too. The 1-year mark arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day of the week it had always been, and which Emily found mildly absurd in the way you found coincidences absurd when you were tired enough to notice them. She worked her shift. It was a busy night. Flu season was beginning its annual demonstration of how many people underestimated the flu. And by midnight, she'd seen 11 patients and hadn't had time to think about anniversaries or notebooks or the specific sequence of events that a year of her life had been organized around. At 2 a.m., between patients, she stood at the window in the break room with bad coffee and looked at the mountains. Janine came in and sat down without being invited, same as the first time, which was now just a thing Janine did that Emily had stopped minding. You okay? Janine asked. Yes. You're allowed to say no. I know, I'm okay. Emily looked at the mountains. It's just a Tuesday. Janine was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to tell you something I've been thinking about for a while. Emily waited. Before all of this happened, before that night, I thought I understood what kind of person you were. I thought you were competent and private and maybe a little cold, and I respected that even if I didn't quite understand it. Janine turned her mug in her hands. And then I watched you that night, and the weeks after, and I realized I'd been doing the same thing everyone else was doing. filling in the parts I didn't know with something easy, something smaller than what was actually there. Emily looked at her. Janine was not a person who said things she didn't mean. That made the things she said matter. I want to be better about that, Janine said. Not just with you, in general. She paused. I think that's the thing this whole situation did for me. It made me think about how many people I've underestimated because I decided who they were before I actually looked. Emily thought about that, about the specific and human impulse to categorize, to finish the sentence before the person had finished speaking, to know someone from the edges rather than the center. She thought about Pruitt, who had done this with maximum confidence and catastrophic results. She thought about Callum, who had done it more cleverly and with more patience, and had still, in the end, miscalculated the thing he was sure he'd measured. People were not the versions of themselves that powerful people decided they were. That was the thing that all of them, Pruitt, Moss, Callum, Fielder, the whole interconnected machinery of it, had gotten wrong. They'd looked at Emily Carter and seen a variable, a risk, a useful piece on a board they thought they controlled. They'd seen her training and her history and her quiet and decided they understood the arithmetic of her. They had been wrong in the specific way that people were wrong when they confused knowing about someone with knowing someone. I think, Emily said carefully, that the way you look at people is something you can actually change, if you decide to. She paused. Most people don't decide to. They just add the new information to the same old framework. She looked at Janine. You're deciding to. Janine nodded, and her eyes were slightly bright, and she didn't make a thing of it. They sat in the break room for a while longer, in the particular companionable quiet of two people who had been through something together and had arrived, by different roads and at different speeds, at something resembling solid ground. Then a call came through, Bay 3, incoming, and Emily stood, and Janine stood, and they went back to work. She wrote the account of her interview with Callum. She submitted it to Voss. She filed the last of her formal statements and reviewed the last of the documents Rita sent her and did what needed to be done in each moment it needed to be done. She consulted on Denton's second workshop in the fall. She ran 3 of the sessions. She was better at it the second time, not because she'd become more comfortable with performing, but because she'd stopped trying to perform and had just told the truth in the direct way she told most things. And the room had responded to that the same way rooms always responded to the actual thing instead of the performance of the thing. She was not the same person she'd been a year ago. She was aware of this without being particularly precious about it. People changed through what happened to them, not always in the directions they'd have chosen, not always cleanly, not always in ways that felt like improvement while they were happening. But she was here. Her hands still worked. She still caught things other people missed. She still chose, every Tuesday and every other shift, to walk into a building full of people who needed someone who knew what they were doing, and to be that person for them, and to document what she saw, and to say the true thing when the true thing needed to be said. She was not special for having survived it. She did not feel like a hero, which she'd been called, at various points in the preceding year, by people who meant it kindly. She felt like a person who had made a series of small decisions, most of them unglamorous, under conditions that kept getting harder, and who had come out the other side intact because the decisions held. That was all it was, in the end. Not silence, not calculation. Not the patience of someone who knew they would win. Just a person who looked at what was true and what was wrong, and what needed to be done about it, and made the decision in front of her, one at a time, the same way every night, and then went back to work.